St. Eormenred's Bees by Elowen Greaves, read by Elspeth Sauer. When the prayers of men rise unanswered, and the saints turn their faces away, the bees shall rise instead. For if the Almighty will not hear, they shall sting him from his throne. Fragment attributed to the rule of St. Eormenred, surviving in one incomplete vellum leaf, undated. I have, in the years since, often reflected that the matter might have been left alone, and my life would now be of a quieter, if altogether duller, shape. Yet even now, as I set down this account, I cannot wholly regret my curiosity. If I was foolish, it was only in the manner that youth is always inclined to be so, not for some idle thrill, but for the beckoning of that strange mingling of the sacred and forbidden that hangs always about old places. It was in the spring of 1887 when I first heard of the ruin at Comberwick, during a visit to my cousin at Evesham Park. The countryside was in its most inviting aspect, that tender green of April, when winter's grip has loosened, but before the weight of summer sets heavily upon the fields. Over dinner, one of my cousin's neighbours, a rather tiresome gentleman fond of his own voice, spoke of curious remnants of monastic holdings that dotted the district. Among these, he mentioned St. Eormenred's cloister and the adjacent folly erected some years later by Lord Ashley, who had acquired the land but quickly lost interest in further alterations before departing for the continent. "Oh, it is not much to see now," he said between spoonfuls of soup. "The foundation is still there, a portion of the cloister garden, what's left of it, and that odd little folly his lordship fancied building nearby. But the real structure, the monastery itself, long gone, of course. The village still chatters about it, though. You know how these places are." When I pressed for the nature of these village tales, he gave a short laugh, clearly pleased to be asked. "Some curious old nonsense about a saint and his bees. A bit of local superstition, you know. The sort of thing villagers tell their children. They say St. Eormenred kept a sacred hive within the cloister, that if God would not answer the prayers of the desperate, the saint's bees might sting the Almighty into attending." He chuckled, waving his hand. "Utter drivel, of course, but the villagers still speak of it with that peculiar fondness they reserve for their absurdities." Absurd it may have sounded to him, but I found myself rather enchanted by the oddity of the tale. The very notion, both pious and blasphemous in equal measure, carried a peculiar weight that clung to my thoughts for days afterward. And so, perhaps inevitably, I resolved to see the place for myself. Edward, my cousin, made some polite protests when I announced my intention, but his objections were mild. In truth, I believe he was relieved to have me find diversion, as country life offered me few amusements. After inquiries on my behalf in the village yielded no solid lead as to how I might obtain access, Edward sent word further afield via the servants and acquaintances. After a few days' time, a result was obtained. He provided me with the name of the old caretaker still in residence at the estate, one Mr. Lyle, and a brief letter of introduction. Lord Ashley himself was abroad, as everyone knew, and his staff was all but dismissed, save for this solitary servant left to oversee the grounds. Oddly enough, no one in the village seemed familiar with this Mr. Lyle among the roster of his lordship's servants, but the acquaintance of an acquaintance who had obtained his name for Edward was, I was assured, the salt of the earth and a pillar of the community. Or perhaps, Edward chuckled, a pillar of salt. Arrangements were made, and it was thus that, a week later, on a soft and cloud-dappled morning, I set out alone on horseback toward Comberwick, entirely unaware of what awaited me in that place where bees may still speak for the unanswered. As I rode, I thought of a conversation a few days prior I had while taking tea with Mrs. Hathaway, the vicar's wife. a kindly woman whose conversation veered always toward village histories, I sought to draw out a little more on this curious legend. She smiled with that gentle indulgence peculiar to country ladies long accustomed to the harmless eccentricities of local tales. "Ah, yes, Saint Eormenred," she said, pouring carefully. "You have heard of his bees already, then?" "I have," I replied, though surely even in jest some must have called him a heretic. To suggest that if heaven remained unmoved, the bees might sting the Almighty himself, well, that is not a doctrine any bishop would have received with gladness. Mrs. Hathaway chuckled softly, stirring her own cup. "Quite so, my dear. I expect even the monks who once kept the place were uneasy with it. But such talk comes more from old wives' tongues than from any proper record, I'm sure." She glanced briefly toward the window, as if ensuring we remained unobserved by any invisible listeners. "You must understand," she continued, lowering her voice just slightly. "Many of these village tales borrow freely from older beliefs, those that linger still in country places, however piously people may attend service on Sundays. The story of the saint's bees, you see, may carry echoes of rather older notions, nature spirits, charms of protection, bargains struck with powers not wholly of heaven, though not quite of the adversary either." Her words hung delicately in the air, like filaments of web stirring in a draught. "But of course," she added with a smile, returning to the safety of conventional opinion, "such are the harmless amusements of rustic imagination. You mustn't let it trouble you." "Of course not," I answered, returning her smile politely. But in truth, I found myself more troubled by her very need to assure me so. As I made my way to Comberwick, the morning was cool, but bright, with a thin veil of mist still clinging low across the fields as I rode. My mare, a steady creature, carried me willingly along the gently winding lanes bordered by budding hedgerows and ancient stone walls, their surfaces furred with moss and lichen. The countryside here was older than much of England, older even than many dared remember. As the village fell behind me, the land opened into undulating meadows, and soon the silhouette of the folly appeared, a curious octagonal tower of pale stone, perched like some misplaced ornament upon the rise beyond the monastery ruins. Though Lord Ashley's taste in architecture had never commanded much admiration, the tower had an odd charm nonetheless, its absurdity softened by distance, and the embrace of encroaching ivy. Below it, nearer to the tree line, lay what remained of the cloister. The outer walls had long since crumbled into low, tumbled fragments, their outlines still suggesting the quadrangle they once enclosed. A few broken columns remained upright, like teeth half swallowed by the earth. In the centre rose a smaller walled enclosure, intact and curiously well maintained, the inner garden to which all local talk had alluded. There, waiting by the narrow gate of wrought iron, stood Mr. Lyle. He was not what I expected. Older, certainly, but neat in his appearance, and of an almost courtly bearing. His grey hair was closely trimmed, his black coat pressed, and though his face was thin, his expression was attentive, without being officious. As I dismounted, he bowed slightly. "Miss," he greeted, "I trust your ride was a pleasant one." "Quite," I replied, handing him the reins, which he accepted with practised ease. "You are Mr. Lyle, I presume?" "At your service." He secured the horse and gestured politely toward the path. "Shall we proceed then, miss? His lordship's secretary instructed that you were to be accommodated should you wish to observe the chapel ground and its peculiarities." I allowed a small smile at his careful phrasing. "The custom is still observed, then?" I asked. Mrs. Hathaway had whispered the rumour to me about one of the more unnerving, yet perhaps intriguing traditions said to have been observed about admission to the cloister garden. I had been told the rule, and though with some trepidation planned to go through with it, nonetheless, I was waiting for Mr. Lyle to actually confirm it. Mr. Lyle inclined his head. It is. The Lord insisted it remain undisturbed, though I suspect he enjoys more the reputation of its strangeness than any true adherence. Still, the rule remains. The rule being that no one enters the inner garden clothed. I allowed myself a small wry breath, a curious prescription. He did not smile. It is the old way, miss, as it was kept by the monks, as it has always been. And the bees, I pressed, are they still here after all these years? At this, Mr. Lyle's gaze grew distant for the briefest moment before returning to its customary politeness. They are present, miss, though not as ordinary bees might be. You need not fear them, so long as the rule is kept. They do not sting, not those of humankind at least. Only others who do not answer. That faint chill, the kind that never comes from air, touched the nape of my neck then, but I straightened, schooling my voice to composure. Very well, Mr. Lyle, let us proceed. Mr. Lyle led me along a gravel path that wound gently toward the inner enclosure. The air here was still, almost unnaturally so. Even the faint breeze that had stirred the trees earlier seemed to have abandoned this little hollow, as though unwilling to trespass further. The low walls of the outer cloister passed by on either side, their broken arches framing slivers of pale sky. Insects hummed softly in the distance, but I heard no birdsong. We reached a small stone vestibule, a kind of antechamber just outside the gate to the inner garden. A wooden bench, worn smooth by years of service, sat against one wall. Beside it stood a simple chest, into which a small key had already been inserted. Mr. Lyle stopped here, and turned to face me with the formality of one reciting words much rehearsed. "Miss," he said, "this is where I must leave you to your preparations. When you have disrobed, you may place your garments within the chest. The key you may keep with you, though you will not need it inside. I will not enter once you proceed, save to guide you through the inner gate itself." He paused, lowering his voice slightly. "When you are ready, I shall blindfold myself and lead you forward. You need not fear for your modesty. I know the way to the gate even without my sight." I nodded once, feeling my heartbeat quicken, not with dread precisely, but with that peculiar tension born of entering some ancient ceremony whose meaning had long outlived its origin. Mr. Lyle stepped back, and with a faint bow, withdrew to wait just beyond sight. I stood alone. The little chamber was cool and shaded, the stone beneath my feet surprisingly smooth. I set my gloves first upon the bench, then my hat, before beginning to unfasten the pearl buttons of my bodice with deliberate care. Each movement carried a strange weight, an awareness that this was not simply the disrobing of one's garments, but of one's distance from whatever had been kept behind that gate for centuries. My skirt was next, its fabric sighing faintly as it fell across my boots, which I soon unlaced and set neatly aside. The corset followed, its laces yielding beneath my fingers as my breath eased. Stockings, petticoat, chemise, all laid gently into the chest in turn, until at last I stood as I had come into the world, feeling the cool air stir lightly against my skin. There was a kind of vulnerability in the moment, yes, but beneath it too, a thrill I could not entirely suppress, as though some secret within me had long awaited this unburdening, without ever knowing it. I closed the lid of the chest and turned the key with a soft click. The little brass handle fit snugly in my palm. "Mr. Lyles," I called softly. He returned at once, carrying a length of black silk. Without once raising his eyes from beneath the blindfold he wore, he spoke with calm assurance. "If you will permit me, miss." I had not realized I, like him, was to be blindfolded. So, sightless and denuded, guided by a man himself blind, I would go. I inclined my head, and he gently tied the blindfold about my face, careful to leave no gap through which even the faintest glimmer might intrude. "Now, if you will take my arm," he said, his voice a steady tether in the gathering strangeness. "I shall lead you forward. The path is short, and you are quite safe." I placed my hand lightly upon his offered arm. The fabric of his sleeve was cool beneath my fingers. And thus we stepped through the gate into the unknown. The ground beneath my feet shifted as we passed through the gate. The even stone gave way to something softer, not grass precisely, but a fine layer of compacted earth, faintly warm from the filtered sun above. I felt each minute change, the subtle rise and fall beneath my soles, the occasional smooth pebble pressing lightly against my heel or arch, the faint crumbling of old leaves worked into the soil over countless seasons. The air grew thicker as we advanced, carrying with it a sweetness unlike anything I had anticipated, not cloying, but rich and strange, like honey warmed under glass, mingled with something older that I could not name. Mr. Lyle's pace was unhurried, steady as a metronome. The faint crunch of his own careful steps served as a kind of reassurance in the blindness, marking each quiet footfall forward. Though I could see nothing, the garden announced itself in other ways. The air hummed, softly at first, but steadily intensifying, a low vibration like the murmur of distant voices speaking just beneath comprehension. The sound was unmistakably that of bees. But unlike the busy, darting hum of an ordinary hive, this was almost musical, as though the creatures moved in deliberate harmony, each wingbeat contributing to a great, slow chord that resonated faintly through the ground and into the arches of my bare feet. The warmth beneath me deepened, and for a brief moment I imagined I could feel subtle, living movements within the soil itself, the faint tremor of countless bodies shifting beneath the surface in rhythms I could neither see nor fully comprehend. We halted. The sound of a second, smaller gate opening came to my ears. "You are arrived, miss," Mr. Lyle said quietly, releasing my arm with great care. "I shall remain here at the threshold. You may stay and explore as long as you wish. When you desire to return, speak my name. And one more thing. Pardon the oddness of my phrase, but do not ignore anything in the garden which asks to be noticed." And with that, I was alone, utterly sightless, standing barefoot upon the warm, breathing ground of St. Eormenred's inner garden, while the bees sang softly all around me. For some moments I stood motionless, breathing carefully, listening to the low symphony of wings about me. The silk blindfold was snug, but not tight against my eyes, its fabric warm now from my skin. My heartbeat sounded louder than the bees themselves, though whether from fear or something perilously near to exhilaration, I could not yet say. The air stirred faintly against my bare shoulders, carrying with it the rich, resinous scent that seemed to permeate every inch of this hidden place. It was not simply the sweetness of honey, but something more, older, darker, like warm amber left long in the earth. At last, I reached up with both hands and found the knot at the nape of my neck. My fingers trembled slightly as I worked it loose, feeling the silken fabric slacken and draw away. For a moment, I kept my eyes closed. The faint breeze traced over my lids like cool fingertips, and I realized how sharp my senses had become in the absence of sight. My awareness of the ground beneath my feet, of the strange chorus humming all around me, seemed amplified. Then, slowly, I opened my eyes. The light was muted, filtered through a high ring of ancient stone and the dense green canopy that arched above the courtyard. The sky was visible only in thin slivers where the leaves allowed it. The garden was smaller than I expected, no more than 30 feet across, enclosed fully by high, unbroken walls. Their surfaces were not the plain grey of weathered stone, but shone faintly with an amber sheen. Thin layers of wax, smoothed and spread as though by countless tiny bodies over generations uncounted. And they were here, bees, not in wild darting clouds as one sees near a common hive, but in precise coiling patterns, curving through the air in deliberate arcs, as if guided by a hand unseen. Their bodies glinted in the light, darker than ordinary bees, their stripes deeper, almost crimson in places. They circled, dipped and hovered, never once colliding, as though bound to some law I could not perceive. In the very centre of the space stood what must once have been the pedestal of a fountain or statue. Upon it rested the hive, an ancient structure of spiralling comb, layered upon itself into strange, irregular forms. The wax was dark, nearly black, with thin veins of red running through it like threads of garnet. The bees did not approach me. Instead, they moved around me, never nearer than a few feet, as though my presence was acknowledged but not unwelcome. And there, behind the pedestal, I saw something else. At first I thought it a trick of light, but no. There stood a shape, tall and indistinct, half concealed in shadow. It was not robed nor winged, but seemed composed of the same living shimmer that filled the air. A form suspended between presence and absence. Neither fully man, fully woman, nor fully beast, but woven from the very pattern of the hive's strange order. Though it made no sound, I felt a pressure, not upon my skin, but within my breast, as if its attention had turned fully toward me. I could not move. My breath came shallow, though not from terror in its common form. Rather, it was the kind of stillness one feels upon the edge of a precipice, the recognition that any movement, any disturbance, might shift the balance of things not entirely within one's understanding. The figure remained as it was, pulsing faintly, almost breathing with the rhythm of the bees that circled above and around. The comb-like structure at the centre of the garden seemed not separate from it, but rather part of the same living system, as though what stood before me had grown up from its layers, fed by their generations of toil. I became aware, too, of an odd sensation beneath my feet. The warmth of the earth deepened, and I felt unmistakably the faintest vibration, not merely the movement of insects, but a pulsing from within the ground itself. It was as though the garden were alive in its entirety, not metaphorically, but truly, its stone, its wax, its air, its unseen channels beneath the soil, all woven into one organism whose purpose I could not fathom. And still the bees sang. Their song was not dissonant. On the contrary, it was beautiful, orderly, harmonious, ancient. But within its beauty was something dreadful in its indifference. This was not music made for human ears. This was an order that predated us, and would continue long after we were gone. The figure made no move toward me. It neither beckoned nor threatened, but its very formlessness was its message, that I stood in the presence of something for which no name in our speech could properly serve. Not saint, nor angel, nor demon, but an office perhaps once glimpsed by Saint Eormenred, whose rule, if such a rule ever existed, had merely brushed against this older, colder intelligence. I do not know how long I stood there. At some point, my body seemed to recall itself, and I stepped backward. One step, then another, my bare feet pressing into the warm, thrumming earth. The bees adjusted their paths subtly, opening a narrow lane, through which I retreated without resistance. Only when my shoulder touched cool stone behind me did I realize I had reached the edge of the garden once more. "Mr. Lyle," I called softly, my voice catching. Instantly his hand was at my arm, steadying me. I retied the silk about my eyes, but loosely this time. "Come, miss," he said, in that same measured, blindfolded calm. "I have you. We shall return." The return through the gate was slower than our entrance had been. I allowed Mr. Lyle to lead me without haste, my hand once again upon the fabric of his sleeve. His movements were sure, his steps unerring as before, and the faint gravel of the path crunched rhythmically beneath his feet. The air beyond the garden seemed thinner, lighter, yet the warmth of that strange courtyard still clung faintly to my skin, like the breath of something that had not quite released me. When we reached the small vestibule once more, Mr. Lyle gently withdrew his arm and spoke in the same composed manner. "You are safely returned, miss. I shall leave you your privacy." Without waiting for reply, he withdrew, his footsteps receding softly along the path, leaving me again alone. I stood quite still, my breath measured, my heart yet unsettled. The silk blindfold still rested loosely about my face, the knot at my neck slack from the careful return journey. I raised my hands, fingers brushing once more against the smooth fabric, and after a moment's pause, I slipped it free. The antechamber lay as before, narrow, quiet, filled with cool stone light. The open air beyond the outer wall beckoned, but I felt no immediate compulsion to return to my garments or resume my former state. Some pull, curious, tremulous, not wholly rational, held me where I stood. I stepped forward, barefoot still upon the smooth stone, feeling its faint chill rise through the arches of my feet. The air here smelled different from that in the cloister proper, thinner, touched with the faint green of ivy creeping through the upper stones, mingled with old earth and forgotten damp. Yet some part of that rich, sweet musk from within still clung faintly to my skin, as though the hive's breath had settled into my very pores. There was, in this exposure, a strange clarity of sensation, a heightened awareness not merely of vulnerability, but of presence. The touch of the air along my collarbone, the faint shifting of unseen draughts curling beneath my hair, the gentle pull of gravity upon my limbs. My own form, freed from its layers of silk and lace and stays, felt oddly foreign and at once natural, as though I had stumbled backward into some older posture of being, neither entirely primitive nor fully civilized. And still I lingered. The inner gate behind me, though closed, seemed to breathe faintly at my back, its iron filigree trembling under the weight of forces that moved not with wind, but with intent. I could not say why I turned once more toward it, nor what I expected to see. But there, beyond the narrow slats, the bees still moved. Their procession had altered now, as if aware of my lingering. The patterns which earlier spiraled gently above the garden now seemed to draw toward the centre, coiling with greater density about the pedestal hive. The great black wax gleamed faintly, the garnet threads within it catching what little light the afternoon offered. And still, behind the hive, that figure remained. Not nearer, not clearer, but subtly more present. Its edges no longer wavered as they had. There was a solidity forming there, though what constituted its body was neither flesh nor mist. Its movement was nearly imperceptible, the smallest turn of what might be its head, as though inclining in recognition of my continued gaze. Though no voice spoke, I felt again that internal pressure, not upon my skin, but somewhere deeper, as though a hand had reached gently into the cavity behind my breastbone and rested there, neither squeezing nor releasing. The bees, too, seemed to hum in answer, their wings setting up a steady, low vibration that resonated faintly against the stone beneath my feet. And then, very slowly, the figure raised one indistinct arm, not toward me, but outward, toward the high ring of wall above. At its gesture, the bees shifted. Their formation parted above the hive, and in the centre of that clearing space, something descended. It was not another creature, but a shape, long, pale, soft as silk, drifting downward like a banner lowered upon invisible cords. It turned as it fell, its motion governed by forces I could not discern, until it came to rest upon the apex of the blackened hive itself. It was a veil, a bridal veil, The veil shimmered faintly as it settled, its fabric impossibly pristine despite the centuries of rot and decay that surrounded it. The fine lacework along its edges caught the dim light like frost on winter branches, and though no breeze disturbed the air, the veil stirred gently, as though breathing along with the hive beneath it. My throat tightened. The gesture was unmistakable. The figure had not simply summoned the veil for its own purpose, it had placed it where I might see, where I might understand that this place, this ritual, had never fully been meant for observation. It had been meant for participation. I stepped back, my bare heels pressing against the cold stone, yet still I could not look away. The bees hovered in their careful orbits, not once touching the fabric, as though honouring its place in the strange order of this consecrated space. The figure, if I could still call it that, stood silent behind the hive, its outline less wavering now, as though strengthened by my presence, or perhaps my growing comprehension. A prickling sensation rose along my skin, not from cold, but from something deeper, a hum beneath the surface of my flesh, mirroring the great slow pulse of the hive itself. It was as if the bees' work resonated not only through the air, but through the marrow of my own body, drawing me into their patient, endless labour. And though no words were spoken, I felt it, a kind of invitation, tender and terrible, as though I had been called long ago before I was born and had now simply arrived at the appointed hour. Part of me desperately wanted to flee. Yet even as the thought came, my legs would not obey. Some thread of dread, of fascination, of something darker still, held me in place. My heart pounded, but not solely from fear. Beneath it was a trembling thrill that I could not wholly deny. It was then I noticed that the bees had shifted once more. The circling ranks began to divide, forming two opposing spirals that mirrored each other on either side of the pedestal, parting a narrow lane between them. The opening led not away, but forward toward the pedestal and its shrouded summit. The message was plain, though unspoken. Approach, and for one breathless moment I very nearly did. My foot hovered at the edge of that narrow path, toes curling faintly against the stone as though testing the weight of my intent. The bees maintained their perfect orbits, their wings setting up a quiet harmony that seemed to pulse directly into my ribs. The figure behind the hive stood motionless, yet its stillness was not passive. It watched, or rather, it waited as though patience itself had taken form. It did not beckon me closer with gesture or word. It simply existed at the centre of that ancient order, confident that I would follow the path laid open before me. And for a moment, an instant both longer and shorter than any measure of time, I felt myself begin to lean forward. It was not compulsion, nor was it true desire. It was something beneath both, the quiet yielding of self before a force that does not demand but anticipates. The air thickened slightly as I shifted my weight, warm, fragrant, like honey dissolved in blood. My bare toes and soles met the warm stone, which now seemed almost to hum beneath my skin. I could feel each small vibration, each faint echo of countless wings. Then there was the faintest sound, a whisper, not from the bees, not from the figure, not from the hive, but from within my own mind. Not yet. The words were not spoken aloud, nor in any voice I knew. They were simply there, lodged behind my eyes like the memory of a thing I had never known but recognised all the same. The spell broke. I staggered back with a soft cry, as though a weight I had not known I carried had suddenly been lifted. My heel struck uneven stone, and I stumbled further, clutching the low wall behind me for balance. At once the bees responded. Their divided spirals closed again, folding gently into a seamless orbit around the hive. The veil atop the dark wax trembled once, then settled. The figure behind the hive did not retreat. It simply resumed its waiting posture, as though my hesitation had been neither surprise nor disappointment, but merely a detail within a ritual long rehearsed. My breath came fast and shallow. My skin flushed hot beneath the faint sheen of sweat, though the air was still cool. I could no longer remain. Clutching the blindfold still wrapped loosely in my hand, I turned away from the gate and fled across the ruined cloister's broken paving. My bare feet struck stone and gravel without care, and though sharp edges bit into my soles, I felt nothing but the urgency to escape. The open fields beyond the ruin seemed vast and empty beneath the grey sky. Yet even as I ran, I could feel that hum behind me, steady, patient, indifferent, growing fainter only as distance widened. The bees did not follow, but they did not need to. I do not recall how long I ran, nor whether I followed any proper path. My feet found their way by instinct alone, carrying me downhill through long grasses and uneven ground, the ruined arches shrinking behind me as I fled. My breath came ragged, my chest tight with exertion, and a rising, sour panic that lodged itself behind my ribs. Only when the hedgerows thickened and the low rooftops of Comberwick village appeared did I slow, my legs trembling beneath me. The cottages seemed impossibly small and ordinary in the face of what I had left behind. The sight of them, however, offered no relief. Rather, they felt like the fragile shells of something long abandoned, pretending still to house the familiar world. A handful of villagers stood outside the small public house at the lane's end, engaged in quiet conversation. As I stumbled toward them, barefoot, my hair loosened and my garments still locked away in the chest back at the cloister, their faces turned with an instant mixture of alarm and confusion, arising of course from my nakedness, my bared feet, exposed body and wild hair, signalling to them I was either a victim in need of help or a madwoman to be feared. One woman let out a short cry, dropping the basket in her hands. An older man stepped forward, reaching out to steady me. "Miss, good heavens, miss, what's happened?" I could not form words at first. My throat was thick, my breath still unsteady. The weight of all that I had seen or felt seemed to drag at my every limb. "Please," I managed at last. I've come from St. Eormenred's ground." The man glanced quickly to the others. "St. Eormenred's? Who's done this to you, child?" "No one." My voice broke, sharp and desperate. I arranged it with Lord Ashley's man, with Mr. Lyle." The silence that followed was sharp as a blade. The villagers exchanged glances, uneasy, searching, and quietly afraid. They still kept their distance, not even so much as yet offering me a means to cover myself, as if they wished to help me, but not at the expense of exposure to some contagion. At last one of the women spoke, her voice soft, as though reluctant to contradict me. "Miss, I don't know who you met, but his lordship's not been home these many months, not since before Christmas. The house stands locked. There's no one there to keep the grounds now." I stared at her, my mouth working soundlessly. But Mr. Lyle..." She shook her head slowly, and the man at my side gave my arm a small, steadying squeeze. "There's been no Mr. Lyle since Lord Ashley left," he said gently. "You've been alone, miss, alone up there this whole time." The world shifted beneath me at that, as though the ground wished to pull me downward. I might have fallen if not for his grip. "Come now," he murmured. "You're safe now. Come inside." I let him guide me forward into the dim interior of the public house, and only now did he offer me his short wool coat to provide myself at least some cover. As the door closed behind us, shutting out the grey sky and its silent hum, I felt the weight of my encounter settle into something colder still. Not terror, nor even confusion, but the dreadful certainty that some part of me had been seen and weighed and gently deferred. "Not yet." The words echoed again, quieter now, as though fading into some deep recess of myself. and yet I knew they remained. I recovered in the following weeks, at least in the outward sense. My cousin, summoned in haste, saw to my care, and though questions were whispered behind closed doors, none dared press me for details. The physician, after much frowning, called it exhaustion of the nerves, and prescribed rest, as though the body might forget what the mind could not. In time, I returned to my family's home, and thence resumed the quiet, predictable patterns of life expected of me. My name was never publicly attached to what had occurred at Comberwick, and for that I am quietly grateful. And yet there are moments, often in spring, when the bees first stir and the air is thick with the scent of warmed honey and young bloom flowers, when I feel again that pressure behind my breastbone, as though something still waits, neither demanding nor forgetting. I have never returned to St. Eormenred's. I know better than to test whether the hour appointed to me has merely been delayed.